The air was crisp as I tightened the straps on my backpack. It was late autumn, and the leaves were a riot of red, orange, and yellow. The trail ahead of me wound into the dense forest, leading to a campsite I'd picked out weeks ago. It wasn't my first solo camping trip, but it was my first time going this deep into the woods. I'd heard about this spot online, a secluded clearing by a lake, miles away from any roads or other campsites, perfect for some peace and quiet. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. The trail was well marked, and the sound of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves kept me company. My pack was heavy, loaded with gear and enough food to last me 2 days. By the time I reached the turnoff that led to the unmarked path toward the lake, the sun was already dipping lower in the sky. The orange light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The unmarked trail was less forgiving. It was narrow, with roots and rocks jutting out at odd angles, forcing me to watch my step. As I pushed deeper into the woods, the sounds of the forest seemed to change. The birds were quieter, replaced by the distant creak of trees swaying in the wind. The air felt cooler, and I noticed the smell of damp earth growing stronger. When I finally reached the clearing by the lake, the sun was just about to set. The lake was smaller than I'd imagined but serene, its surface reflecting the fiery colors of the sky. I set down my pack and stretched, feeling the ache in my shoulders and legs. The clearing was surrounded by tall pines, their dark silhouettes standing stark against the fading light. I wasted no time setting up camp. My tent went up quickly, a small dome that I secured with stakes and tied down with guy lines. I gathered some rocks to form a fire ring and used a folding saw to collect fallen branches for firewood. By the time I got the fire going, the sky was a deep navy, and stars were beginning to appear. Sitting by the fire, eating a simple meal of instant noodles and jerky, I felt a sense of calm. The lake was perfectly still, and the only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. It was exactly what I'd come here for: solitude and the chance to disconnect from everything. As the fire died down, I decided to call it a night. I doused the embers with water from the lake, making sure there was no chance of a stray spark igniting the dry leaves around me. Crawling into my sleeping bag, I felt the exhaustion of the day's hike catch up with me. The tent was small but cozy, and I drifted off to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The tent was pitch black, and I could hear the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I stayed still, straining to listen. There it was, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started to pound as I tried to pinpoint the direction. It was coming from somewhere near the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. This was the forest, after all. But the footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They were too deliberate, too slow. I reached for the flashlight by my side, gripping it tightly. Slowly, I unzipped the tent door just enough to peek outside. The fire pit was cold and dark, and the clearing was bathed in pale moonlight. I couldn't see anything moving. The sound stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. I stayed there, half out of my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand, listening. Then, just as I was beginning to convince myself I'd imagined it, the footsteps started again. This time, they were closer. I shone the flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trees at the edge of the clearing cast long, jagged shadows, but there was no sign of anyone. I swept the light back and forth, my pulse racing. Still nothing. Finally, the footsteps stopped, and the forest was silent once more. I retreated into the tent, zipping it up all the way and tightening the drawstring on my sleeping bag. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox. But sleep didn't come easily after that. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of movement. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent into the cool, damp air. The clearing looked peaceful, almost impossibly so after the unease of the night. I scanned the ground near the edge of the clearing where I'd heard the footsteps. There were no tracks, at least none that looked human, just a scattering of leaves and pine needles. I decided to stay busy to shake off the lingering anxiety. After breakfast, I explored the area around the lake. The water was crystal clear, and I could see fish swimming just below the surface. I followed the shoreline for a while, enjoying the quiet and taking in the scenery. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was high in the sky, and I was feeling more at ease. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I spent the afternoon reading and whittling a piece of wood I'd found. As the sun began to set, I started another fire and cooked dinner. Sitting by the fire, I felt a sense of accomplishment. I'd faced my fears and stayed put despite the unsettling experience the night before. That night, I made sure to keep the fire burning longer, feeding it until the coals glowed a deep orange. I crawled into my tent, feeling more prepared. But sometime after midnight, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was the sound of something scraping against the outside of my tent. My stomach dropped as I froze, trying to make sense of the noise. It was slow and deliberate, like someone dragging a stick or a finger along the fabric. The sound moved from one side of the tent to the other, pausing near the zipper. I'd left my flashlight within reach, and I grabbed it, my hand shaking. With one quick motion, I turned it on and pointed it toward the sound. The scraping stopped instantly. I didn't dare unzip the tent this time. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, my heart racing so hard I thought it might burst. Minutes passed, maybe hours, and I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, the first light of dawn filtered through the fabric of the tent. I waited until the clearing was fully illuminated before I stepped outside. There were marks on the tent, faint but unmistakable. Long, thin streaks that ran from one side to the other. They could have been from a branch or a stick, but they felt too precise, too intentional. I packed up my gear in record time, every nerve in my body on edge. The peaceful solitude of the forest had turned into something oppressive, almost sinister. The hike back to the main trail was grueling. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, and I constantly found myself looking over my shoulder. By the time I reached the marked trail, my legs were trembling, and my back was slick with sweat despite the cool air. When I finally made it back to my car, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I tossed my pack into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. Sitting there, catching my breath, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it really had been an animal, or maybe my mind had been playing tricks on me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched, that someone, or something, had been out there with me. As I drove away, the forest seemed to close in behind me, the trees standing like silent sentinels. I told myself I'd never go camping alone again. Whatever peace I'd been looking for out there wasn't worth the lingering sense of unease that followed me long after I'd left those woods behind. The air smelled of pine and damp earth as I stepped out of my car and into the forest parking lot. The sun was low, painting the horizon with shades of orange and purple, and a cool breeze tugged at the leaves. This was supposed to be my escape, a weekend in solitude, away from emails, texts, and the endless hum of the city. Just me, my tent, and the quiet of nature. The trailhead stretched ahead, winding through tall trees and underbrush. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, double-checked my supplies, water, food, flashlight, knife, and first aid kit, and set off. The trail was well marked, a dirt path lined with the occasional wooden post bearing faded trail markers. I'd picked this spot because it wasn't too remote but still felt isolated enough to give me the solitude I craved. The plan was simple: hike a few miles to a designated campsite, set up for the night, and spend the next day exploring the surrounding trails. The first mile was uneventful, just the crunch of my boots on dirt and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. Squirrels darted across the path, and birds called out in the canopy above. I paused occasionally to admire the scenery: a cluster of ferns here, a fallen tree covered in moss there. The forest felt alive but peaceful, its rhythm slower and more deliberate than the world I'd left behind. About an hour in, the trail began to climb. The incline was steady but manageable, and I welcomed the physical challenge. My breathing grew heavier, but the exertion felt good. I passed a small stream trickling over rocks and stopped to refill my water bottle, using a filter to ensure it was safe to drink. The cold water was refreshing, and I sat for a moment on a nearby rock, listening to the soft gurgle of the stream. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the forest was awash in twilight. The site was simple: a cleared area with a fire ring and enough flat ground to pitch a tent. I chose a spot a little away from the trail, near a cluster of trees that offered some privacy. Setting up the tent was second nature to me, and within 20 minutes, I had my temporary home ready. I unrolled my sleeping bag and pad inside and placed my gear neatly by the entrance. With the tent sorted, I turned my attention to the fire. Gathering wood was easy. The area had plenty of fallen branches and twigs. I built a small fire in the ring, lighting it with a match and some dry leaves. As the flames took hold, I sat back and let the warmth wash over me. The crackling fire, the chirp of crickets, and the distant hoot of an owl were the only sounds. It was perfect. Dinner was simple: a packet of dehydrated chili rehydrated with hot water. It wasn't gourmet, but it hit the spot after the hike. I ate slowly, savoring the meal and the quiet. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was a glittering canvas. I leaned back against a log, staring up at them, and felt a deep sense of peace. This was what I'd come for. As the fire died down, I packed away my trash and secured my food in a bare bag, hanging it from a tree branch a safe distance from my tent. I didn't want any uninvited visitors during the night. I doused the fire thoroughly, making sure it was completely out, then crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm and comforting, and exhaustion soon took over. I drifted off to the sounds of the forest. I don't know what woke me. It was still dark, and the air inside the tent felt cold. I lay still, listening. At first, all I heard was the usual forest noise: the rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a cricket. But then there was something else, faint and distant. It sounded like a branch snapping. My heart quickened. It could have been anything, an animal, maybe a deer, but in the stillness of the night, it felt unnerving. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The tent walls glowed faintly, but outside, the light revealed only shadows. I stayed quiet, straining to hear. Another snap, closer this time. My mind raced through possibilities. Raccoons, coyotes, maybe even another hiker. But it didn't feel right. The sound was deliberate, almost cautious. Gripping the flashlight, I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make a sound. The cold night air rushed in, and I stepped out, scanning the area. The trees cast long, dark shadows, and the faint light of the moon barely illuminated the ground. My breath misted in front of me as I turned in a slow circle. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the forest. I told myself it was probably an animal and went back inside. But sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of leaves or creak of would set my nerves on edge. I lay there, staring at the tent ceiling, until exhaustion finally won. Morning came with a pale, gray light filtering through the trees. I felt groggy but relieved to see the sun again. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore a nearby trail. The unsettling noises from the night before lingered in my mind, but I pushed them aside. It was probably nothing, I told myself. The new trail was narrower and less maintained than the main one, winding deeper into the forest. I followed it for a couple of hours, stopping occasionally to admire a view or check my map. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The usual chatter of birds and rustling of small animals faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. It felt as though the trees were closing in around me. I came across a small clearing and decided to take a break. Sitting on a fallen log, I sipped some water and tried to shake off the growing unease. That's when I noticed it. A faint trail leading off from the clearing, barely visible through the underbrush. It wasn't marked on my map, and curiosity got the better of me. The trail was rough, overgrown with weeds and branches, but it seemed to lead somewhere. I followed it for about half a mile before stumbling upon something unexpected. An old, dilapidated cabin. The roof sagged, and the wooden walls were weathered and covered in moss. It looked abandoned, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. Against my better judgment, I approached. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I peeked inside and saw a single room, empty except for a broken chair and a rusted wood stove. The floor was littered with leaves and debris, and the air smelled damp and musty. There was nothing of interest, but the sight of the cabin unsettled me. Who had built it and why had they left? I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. Fresh footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were faint but unmistakable, leading away from the cabin and back toward the main trail. My pulse quickened. Someone had been here recently. I followed the footprints for a short distance before they disappeared into the underbrush. The forest felt oppressive now, the trees looming like silent watchers. I decided it was time to head back to my campsite. The unease I'd been trying to ignore had grown into a gnawing sense of dread. The hike back felt longer than it should have, every sound amplified by my heightened senses. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was low in the sky. I quickly gathered more wood and built a fire, its light and warmth a small comfort against the growing darkness. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest felt different, less inviting and more menacing. I stayed by the fire as long as I could, scanning the shadows beyond its glow. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept my flashlight and knife within easy reach. Sleep was fitful, and I woke several times to the same snapping sounds I'd heard the night before. Each time, I held my breath, listening, but the sounds never came closer. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. The plan to stay a second night was abandoned. As I hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest, so peaceful when I'd arrived, now felt like a place I needed to escape. I reached the parking lot by mid-morning, relieved to see my car waiting. As I loaded my gear, I glanced back at the trailhead. The forest seemed unchanged, its secrets hidden in the shadows. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove away, vowing to stick to more familiar trails next time. The experience stayed with me. I don't know who or what was out there, but I've learned to trust my instincts. The forest is beautiful, but it's also wild and unpredictable. It's a place where you're not always in control, and sometimes it reminds you of that in unsettling ways. I still hike and camp, but I'm more cautious now. Some places are better left unexplored. I had always liked the idea of camping alone. The peace, the solitude, the chance to detach from everything. It sounded perfect. So, when I finally got a weekend off from work, I decided to head out to the woods near Black Creek. It wasn't far from my hometown, maybe a 2-hour drive, and the area was known for its quiet trails and serene landscapes. I figured it would be the perfect getaway to clear my head. I packed light but made sure I had all the essentials: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a basic cooking setup, and plenty of food and water. My phone was fully charged, but I also brought a power bank and a paper map, just in case. I'd read enough stories about people getting lost in the woods to know better than to rely solely on technology. The drive to Black Creek was uneventful. The road wound through hills and patches of forest, the kind of scenery that made you roll down the windows and take a deep breath of fresh air. By the time I arrived at the parking area near the trailhead, it was early afternoon. A few other cars were parked there, but the place wasn't crowded. I grabbed my gear, locked my car, and set off down the trail. The first few miles were exactly what I'd hoped for: peaceful. The trail was well marked, winding through dense trees that occasionally opened up to reveal stunning views of the surrounding hills. I passed a couple of hikers coming back the other way, but for the most part, I was alone. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of leaves as a bird or squirrel darted by. I'd planned to set up camp near a small stream I'd seen on the map. It was about 5 miles in, a good distance to feel remote, but not so far that I'd be exhausted by the time I got there. When I arrived, the spot was even better than I'd imagined. The stream was clear and shallow, babbling softly as it flowed over smooth stones. There was a flat area nearby that looked perfect for pitching my tent. I set down my pack and got to work. Setting up camp didn't take long. The tent went up easily, and I laid out my sleeping bag inside. I gathered some dry wood from the surrounding area and built a small fire pit, then lit the fire and set a pot of water to boil. As I waited for it to heat up, I sat back and took in the surroundings. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The air smelled fresh and earthy, and the sound of the stream was soothing. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, watching the flames dance. The sky above me turned from deep blue to black, and stars began to appear, one by one. It was the kind of night that made you feel small in the best possible way, like the universe was reminding you of your place in the grand scheme of things. I went to bed early, tired from the hike and eager to get an early start the next day. The tent felt snug and safe, and I fell asleep quickly to the sound of the stream and the occasional hoot of an owl. I woke up in the middle of the night, though, and that's when things started to feel off. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The forest was quiet, save for the faint sound of the stream. I lay there for a moment, listening. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, coming from somewhere just beyond the edge of my campsite. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer. Animals were bound to be curious about the fire and the smell of food. But the sound didn't fade or move away. It stayed in the same general area circling my camp. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peered out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the campsite. Beyond that, it was pitch dark. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks and underbrush, but I didn't see anything unusual. Still, the rustling sound continued, now seeming to come from a different direction. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, scanning the woods with my flashlight, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, the sound stopped, and the forest was silent again. I climbed back into my tent, but it took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and on edge. The sunlight streaming through the trees did little to ease my nerves. I checked the area around my campsite and found nothing out of the ordinary. No tracks, no signs of anything having been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. I decided to stick to my original plan and spend another night in the woods. but I couldn't relax. I spent the day exploring the area, taking short hikes and keeping close to the stream so I wouldn't lose my way. But every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder or stopping to listen, convinced I'd heard something behind me. Each time, there was nothing there. That evening, I built up the fire a little higher than usual, hoping the light and heat would keep whatever it was away. I ate dinner quickly, my appetite diminished by my lingering unease, and retreated to my tent as soon as the sun set. Once again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, the rustling was louder, closer. My heart started pounding as I lay there, straining to hear. Then I caught another sound. A low, almost imperceptible creak, like the sound of a branch bending under weight. Whatever it was, it wasn't small. I grabbed my flashlight and my camping knife, the only weapon I had, and stepped out of the tent. The fire had burned low again, but it was enough to cast faint shadows. I swept the flashlight around the perimeter of the campsite, my hand trembling slightly, and then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the firelight, something moved. It was quick, disappearing into the trees before I could get a good look, but it was definitely there. It had been upright, tall, not an animal, person. I called out, my voice louder and more forceful than I felt. "Who's there?" No response, just silence, thick and heavy. My mind raced. Why would someone be out here in the middle of nowhere, creeping around my campsite? Were they lost? Or was it something worse? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, feeding it wood to keep it burning bright, clutching the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. But nothing else happened. Whoever or whatever it was didn't come back. At the first light of dawn, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I wanted to get out of there, back to the safety of my car and the comfort of civilization. The hike back to the trailhead felt twice as long as it had on the way in. Every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me or see someone lurking in the shadows. But the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the parking area, I almost cried with relief. My car was right where I'd left it, untouched. I threw my pack into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, I took one last look at the trailhead in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving among the trees, a flicker of motion that sent a chill down my spine. But I didn't stop to look closer. I drove straight home, my mind replaying the events of the past 2 nights over and over. I still don't know who or what was out there with me, and maybe I never will. But one thing's for sure, I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. The sun was low when I finally set up my camp. The forest around me was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I had chosen this spot deliberately, far from the trails and deep enough into the wilderness that I wouldn't encounter anyone. It was the kind of solitude I had been craving for months. Life in the city had become a blur of noise and obligation, and I needed this escape to reset. My tent was simple but sturdy. I'd pitched it on a flat patch of ground beneath a canopy of tall pines. The air was cool but not uncomfortably so, and the scent of pine needles and damp earth filled my lungs. As I arranged my gear and prepared my little campfire, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what I needed. No emails, no deadlines, no people. Just me and the forest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest shifted. The golden light turned to deep orange and then faded to gray. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the faint hum of insects became more pronounced. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned beans and bread. It wasn't gourmet, but out here, it tasted better than anything from a fancy restaurant. The warmth of the fire was comforting, and the dancing flames provided just enough light to push back the encroaching darkness. It was around this time that I started to notice the sounds. At first, they were faint, so subtle that I thought I might be imagining them. A soft crunch of leaves here, a faint snap of a twig there, could have been anything. Animals were everywhere in the forest, and I had seen deer tracks earlier in the day. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon nosing around, maybe curious about the smell of my food. Still, I felt a prickle of unease. The sounds didn't seem to follow the random pattern of animal movement. They were too deliberate, too spaced out. It was as if someone or something was circling my camp, moving just out of sight. I told myself I was being paranoid. Spending too much time alone can do that to a person. I decided to ignore it. I stoked the fire, adding another log, and pulled my sleeping bag closer to the flames. The warmth was soothing, and I tried to focus on that rather than the occasional rustle in the darkness. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and crawled into my tent. The thin nylon walls felt insubstantial against the vastness of the forest, but they were all I had. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. The forest was alive with noise, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, trying to calm my mind. I'd done plenty of solo camping before, but something about this night felt different. Eventually, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was waking up to complete silence. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and unnatural. Even the crickets had stopped. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know why. I lay there, straining to hear something, anything, but the only sound was the faint rustle of the wind in the trees. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't move like that. This was a human step, the crunch of a boot on dry leaves. I froze, my mind racing. Who else could possibly be out here? I hadn't seen a single person all day, and I was miles from the nearest trail. The footsteps didn't continue. Whoever it was, they had stopped right outside my tent. I could feel the weight of their presence, though I couldn't see or hear anything else. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I reached for the knife I kept in my pack, my hand shaking as I fumbled to unzip the pocket. I'd brought it more for utility than defense, but at that moment, it felt like the only thing standing between me and whatever was out there. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. Time felt warped. I stayed perfectly still, clutching the knife, listening for any hint of movement. Finally, I heard the footsteps again, moving away this time. They were slow and deliberate, fading into the distance until I could no longer hear them. I didn't dare move. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the sound to return. When dawn finally broke, I was still wide awake. The first light of day felt like a lifeline, and I unzipped my tent with trembling hands. The forest looked unchanged, serene even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked the perimeter of my camp, looking for any sign of who or what had been there. At first, I saw nothing, but then I spotted it. A single boot print in the soft earth just a few feet from my tent. It was unmistakably human. I packed up my camp in record time. The thought of spending another night out there was unbearable. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the forest remained empty. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost overwhelming. I threw my gear into the back seat and locked the doors the moment I was inside. As I drove away, I couldn't stop replaying the night in my mind. Who had been out there? Why hadn't they approached me or made their presence known? I've tried to rationalize it since then. Maybe it was another camper who stumbled across my site and decided to keep their distance. Maybe it was a hunter or a local out for a late-night walk. But the truth is, I'll never know. And that's what stays with me. The uncertainty, the not knowing. The forest is vast, and people, the ones you don't see, can be just as unpredictable as the wilderness itself. I never liked driving at night. It's not the darkness or the quiet that unsettles me, but the isolation. When you're on the road, miles away from the nearest town, there's nothing but the hum of the engine, the occasional flicker of headlights in the rear view, and the blackness stretching ahead. It's in that emptiness where things feel like they could go wrong. And when you're in the middle of nowhere, it's as if the world forgets you exist. That night, though, I had no choice but to drive. I'd been at my uncle's cabin up in the mountains, a small getaway spot we'd used as a place of refuge for years. It wasn't fancy, just a simple log cabin with a porch that overlooked miles of dense woods. He'd passed a few weeks earlier, and I was there to clean things up, get rid of the old furniture, and lock up for the last time. The weather had been strange all day. Overcast skies, thick and heavy, hanging low, almost as if they were about to drop something. I hadn't planned on staying that late, but as the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows lengthened, I realized I wouldn't be able to make it back to the city until well after dark. I packed up my things quickly, took one last look at the empty cabin, and started the drive back down the mountain road. My car, an older model, sputtered as I shifted into gear. The engine sounded fine, but something about the way it hummed in the cold, lonely air made me uneasy. The road I was on was narrow, winding, and carved through thick forests. Trees on both sides of me stretched their branches toward the sky, like they were reaching to grab the car and pull me into the blackness. There weren't any streetlights, no signs of civilization. The further I went, the more the road seemed to twist and bend in unnatural ways. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The road seemed to go on forever, and I had a feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the darkness. It was the silence, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums and made you feel small and insignificant. My headlights barely cut through the night, casting long, sharp shadows across the road ahead. I wasn't sure how long I had been driving, but it felt like an eternity. Time seemed to distort in this place, as if I were moving through some kind of limbo. I checked the map on my phone again. The screen showed nothing but a long stretch of road with no end in sight. I cursed under my breath and tapped the gas pedal, trying to force myself to feel normal. But then, something in the distance caught my eye. I almost didn't notice it at first. It was a flicker of light, just a small dot in the distance, but it was enough to make my heart skip. I thought it might be another car coming the opposite way, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a car's headlights. It was something off. The light was too steady, too still, and it didn't move. It was like a small lantern just floating in the dark, right in the middle of the road. I slowed down, my tires crunching over the gravel, as I stared at it. For a moment, I thought about turning around, but there was no place to turn around. The road was too narrow, and I had already passed the last turnoff miles back. As I got closer, I could see more clearly that it wasn't a lantern at all. It was a faint, pale light coming from a small structure, a shack. It looked abandoned, worn down. Its dark wood was peeling, and the roof had collapsed in places. I felt a shiver run down my spine. What was a shack doing out here, miles from anything? There was no reason for it to be there. I pulled the car to a stop a good distance away from the shack. I wasn't sure what drew me to it, but I couldn't just drive past. I had to check it out. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't leave without understanding what it was. I killed the engine and stepped out into the night. The air was freezing, biting my skin. I wrapped my arms around myself as I stared at the shack. There was no sign of life, but there was something about it that made my stomach churn. I took a few steps toward it, crunching the gravel beneath my boots. The light, now that I was closer, appeared to be coming from a small window on the side of the building. It was dim but steady, casting faint shadows on the ground. I had no idea where it was coming from. I reached for the door, which hung loosely on its hinges. It creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The inside was a mess. Old furniture, broken bottles, and crumpled papers were scattered across the floor. A faint smell of mildew and decay hung in the air. But what caught my attention immediately was the strange arrangement in the corner of the room. There was a large wooden crate, the kind used for storing old supplies. It was sitting upright, surrounded by what looked like dirt, but the dirt was in small, neatly arranged piles. In the middle of these piles was a small, unmarked bottle. The liquid inside it was clear, but there was something unsettling about it. The bottle looked out of place in the chaos of the shack. My heart was pounding now. I had to leave. I had to get back in the car and drive away. But I couldn't move. It was as if my body was paralyzed by some invisible force. I took a step closer to the crate, my shoes scraping the floor. As I moved, I noticed something strange. There was something written on the side of the crate. It was scrawled hastily in a dark red substance. I couldn't tell if it was paint or something else. It read, "Don't let it out." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, staring at them. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Everything inside me screamed to leave, to turn around and run, but my feet stayed rooted to the ground. The light in the window flickered, then dimmed, and that's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound coming from the back of the shack. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there. The room was still, silent. For a long moment I waited. My mind raced, but my body remained frozen. Then slowly, ever so slowly, I heard it again. The scraping sound, louder now, closer. It was as if something or someone was moving around in the dark. I felt a sudden wave of panic wash over me. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran back to the door. As I reached for the handle, a low, guttural sound filled the air. It was a growl, deep and primal. I slammed the door open and sprinted back to the car. My heart was hammering in my chest as I fumbled for the keys, trying to get the engine started. My hands were shaking, and for a moment, I couldn't get the key in the ignition. The growling came again, louder now and closer. I felt the weight of it in my bones. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what it was. Finally, the engine roared to life and I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The tires screeched as I spun the car around, kicking up gravel behind me. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I just drove. I drove and drove, not stopping until I reached the nearest town, hours away. I didn't know what had happened back there, but I knew one thing for certain. There was something out there, in the middle of nowhere, something I couldn't explain, something I would never understand. The road had ended, but the feeling of being followed never did. It started as one of those weekends you dream about during a busy work week. A quiet, solitary escape into the woods, away from emails, phone calls, and the hum of everyday life. I packed light: a small tent, a sleeping bag, my trusted camping stove, and enough food for a couple of nights. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, far from any marked trails or campsites. Somewhere remote, untouched, where I could feel truly alone. The drive was peaceful, the road winding through small towns, dense woods, and rolling hills. By the time I reached the dirt track that led to my chosen area, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows through the trees. I parked my car at the edge of the track and hoisted my backpack. The trail I followed wasn't official. just a faint path beaten down by the occasional hiker or hunter. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. After about 2 hours of walking, I found the perfect clearing. It was a small patch of flat ground surrounded by towering pines and bordered by a babbling creek. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and fallen leaves. I set up my tent near the creek, where the sound of running water would lull me to sleep. By the time I got everything in order, the sky had turned a deep orange, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I cooked a simple dinner, just some instant noodles and a can of beans, and sat by the creek, watching the sky transition from twilight to full darkness. Out here, without city lights, the stars seemed impossibly bright, a dense blanket of light stretching across the sky. It was perfect. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up early, feeling refreshed, and spent the morning exploring the area around my campsite. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, and I even spotted a deer grazing in a nearby meadow. I spent the day hiking, following the creek upstream and taking in the beauty of the untouched wilderness. I didn't see another soul all day, which was exactly what I wanted. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. It began with a sound. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard it. A faint crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, straining my ears. It was faint, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, but it was there. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a fox. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it sounded distinctly human. I stood up and shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks and dense undergrowth, but I didn't see anything. The sound had stopped. I waited for a while, standing still, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, being alone in the woods at night can make you hyper-aware of every little sound. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle, every creak of the trees seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. I kept telling myself it was just the forest's natural sounds, but deep down, I felt uneasy. The next morning, I found something that made my heart race. About 20 yards from my campsite, near the edge of the creek, I saw footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. Bare feet. They weren't mine. I had been wearing boots the entire time. The tracks were fresh, the edges still sharp in the soft soil. They led from the creek into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at the footprints, trying to make sense of them. Had someone been watching me? Was it just a coincidence? Maybe another hiker had passed through the area. But why barefoot? And why hadn't I seen or heard anyone else? I debated packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself to stay. It was broad daylight, and the thought of cutting my trip short because of some footprints felt irrational. I spent the day trying to enjoy myself, but the unease lingered. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. That night, the sounds returned. I was in my tent, lying in my sleeping bag, when I heard them. Faint, deliberate footsteps circling my campsite. My heart pounded as I lay there, trying to stay as still and quiet as possible. The footsteps would stop for a while, then start again, always just beyond the edge of my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. Shining the beam into the darkness, I saw nothing. The forest was silent. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed in my tent, clutching my camping knife, listening for any sign of movement. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. Whatever or whoever was out there, I didn't want to find out. As I packed up my campsite, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me. The walk back to my car felt endless. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my pulse quicken. I kept my knife in my hand the entire time, ready for anything. When I finally reached the dirt track where my car was parked, I felt a wave of relief. But as I approached, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My car's tires had been slashed, all 4 of them. The rubber was shredded, rendering the car completely useless. Panic set in. I was miles from the nearest road with no cell service and no way to drive out. Whoever had been watching me must have done this. I looked around, scanning the woods, but saw no one. The forest was silent, the trees standing like sentinels, indifferent to my plight. I knew I couldn't stay by the car. If someone had sabotaged it, they might come back. My only option was to hike out to the main road and hope to flag down a passing car. I grabbed my backpack, took a deep breath, and started walking. The hike was grueling. The dirt track was uneven, winding through dense forest with no clear end in sight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, paranoid that I was being followed. As the hours passed, my legs grew tired, and my water supply dwindled. The sun was starting to set, and the thought of being stuck in the woods after dark filled me with dread. Just as the last light of day was fading, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were unmistakable, coming from behind me, getting closer. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps quickened, matching my pace. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting away, putting as much distance as possible between me and whoever was following me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. The main road, a narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the forest. I burst out of the trees, gasping for breath, and stumbled onto the road. There was no one in sight, no cars, no houses, just empty road stretching in both directions. But I didn't care. I was out of the woods. I started walking along the road, hoping to find help. Eventually, a pickup truck appeared in the distance. I waved it down, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, pulled over. I explained what had happened as best I could, though I left out the part about being followed. He gave me a ride to the nearest town, where I was able to call for help. The next day, I returned to the forest with a tow truck to retrieve my car. It was still there, untouched, but the sight of those slashed tires brought back the fear. I never found out who or what was out there that weekend. The footprints, the footsteps, the slashed tires. They're questions that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I haven't been camping since. It started as a spur-of-the-moment trip, a chance to disconnect from the grind of work and immerse myself in nature. I'd been working long hours, buried in spreadsheets and deadlines, and I craved the simplicity of the outdoors. So, I packed my gear, loaded up my car, and headed out to a remote camping site I'd read about online. The reviews promised solitude, stunning views, and a network of trails that would challenge even seasoned hikers. It was exactly what I needed. The campsite was nestled deep within the forest, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The last 30 minutes of the drive were on a dirt road that twisted and turned through dense trees. I could feel the hum of civilization fading with every mile. By the time I pulled into the clearing that served as a parking area, my phone had lost service. I wasn't bothered. I'd planned for this. I had a map, a compass, and enough supplies to last me 3 days. The air was crisp and carried the scent of pine and damp earth. I slung my backpack over my shoulders and set out on the trail. The path was narrow, flanked by towering trees whose branches intertwined overhead, forming a natural canopy. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional chirp of birds. It felt good to be away from the constant buzz of notifications and traffic. Here, it was just me and the wilderness. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing by a lake. The water was so still it mirrored the sky and the surrounding forest. This was where I decided to set up camp. I pitched my tent on a patch of level ground, gathered some wood for a fire, and unpacked my gear. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I was sitting by a crackling fire, eating a simple meal of canned beans and bread. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. The first night passed without incident. I'd expected to struggle to fall asleep. The ground was harder than my mattress at home, and the noises of the forest were unfamiliar, but exhaustion took over and I slept deeply. I woke up to the sound of birdsong and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. The map showed a network of trails radiating from the lake, some leading to higher ground with promises of panoramic views. I chose a trail that seemed manageable but still challenging. It wound its way uphill, weaving through dense clusters of trees and crossing over small streams. As I climbed, the terrain grew steeper, and the forest thinned out, giving way to rocky outcrops and patches of wildflowers. The higher I went, the more the view expanded. By midday, I reached a ridge that offered a breathtaking panorama of the valley below. I could see the lake where I'd set up camp, glinting in the sunlight like a shard of glass. It was a moment of pure contentment. The descent was trickier than the climb. The loose rocks made the path treacherous, and I had to move carefully to avoid slipping. About halfway down, I noticed something unusual. A small pile of rocks had been arranged deliberately on the side of the trail. It wasn't the kind of thing nature would create on its own. Someone had been here recently. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe another hiker had passed through. But as I continued down the trail, I noticed more of these rock piles, spaced at irregular intervals. Each one seemed to grow more elaborate, with sticks and bits of moss added to the arrangement. By the time I reached the lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the area recently, maybe even while I was out hiking. I scanned the clearing where my tent was pitched but saw no signs of disturbance. Everything was just as I'd left it. Still, the thought lingered in my mind as I went about the rest of my day. I spent the evening fishing by the lake and cooking my catch over the fire. The fresh air and exertion had worked up an appetite, and the meal tasted better than anything I'd had in weeks. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The forest, which had seemed so inviting during the day, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made me tense. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound didn't come again. Telling myself it was just an animal, I eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore a different trail. This one led to a series of small waterfalls about 3 miles from the campsite. The hike was less strenuous than the previous days, and the sound of rushing water was a welcome change from the silence of the forest. I spent a couple of hours there, taking in the scenery and snapping a few photos with the small camera I'd brought along. It was mid-afternoon by the time I started back. As I neared the campsite, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. One of the rock piles I'd seen the day before was now at the edge of the clearing where my tent stood. It hadn't been there that morning. I'd walked past the spot on my way to the waterfalls, and I was certain I would have noticed it. The arrangement was intricate, almost like a miniature sculpture. Someone had been here while I was gone. I checked my tent and my belongings. Nothing was missing or out of place, but the sense of unease was impossible to ignore. I considered packing up and leaving, but the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, and I didn't relish the idea of navigating the dirt road in the dark. I decided to stay one more night, though I resolved to keep my knife within easy reach. That evening, I kept the fire going longer than usual. The flames provided a sense of security, though I knew they would do little to deter anyone determined to approach. I sat by the fire, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises, a branch snapping, the crunch of leaves underfoot, but they were too sporadic and distant to pinpoint. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the zipper partially open so I could see the fire and the surrounding area. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. The forest was deathly quiet. It took me a moment to realize what had woken me. A sound, close by. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of fabric being brushed against or moved. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining to hear more. Then came another sound, this one unmistakable, the faint crunch of footsteps just outside the tent. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the sound began again, moving around the tent. Whoever it was, they were circling me. I didn't dare move. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? Another camper? Someone up to no good? Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening intently. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, I gathered the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty. The embers of the fire cast long shadows, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. I scanned the tree line, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Nothing moved. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in the tent, the knife clutched in my hand. Sleep was out of the question. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear and left. The hike back to the car felt like it took an eternity. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made me jump. When I finally reached the parking area, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The car was just as I'd left it. I threw my backpack into the trunk, got behind the wheel, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was back on the main road, with the forest fading into the distance, that I allowed myself to relax. I'd gone into the wilderness seeking peace and solitude, but I'd found something else entirely, a reminder that nature, while beautiful, can also be unpredictable and unsettling. I don't know who or what was out there with me, and maybe it's better that way. All I know is that I'll think twice before venturing into the woods alone again. I didn't think much of it when I decided to go camping alone that weekend. It was something I'd done many times before. Being out in nature, away from the hum of city life, was my way of resetting. Just me, the trees, the stars, and the endless quiet. That was the plan, at least. I picked a spot I'd been to once before, years ago. A place deep in the national forest, far enough off the beaten path that you'd be hard-pressed to find another soul. It wasn't an official campsite, no picnic tables or fire pits, but that was part of the appeal. I packed light: a tent, a sleeping bag, a small propane stove, some dehydrated meals, a water filter, and the usual essentials. My phone came along too, though service out there was non-existent. It was just a glorified flashlight and camera at that point. The drive took me 2 hours, and the hike to the spot another 3. By the time I arrived, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest was dense, the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. I found a clearing just large enough for my tent, with a small stream nearby for water. It was perfect. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent on a patch of soft ground and arranging my gear inside. As the last light faded, I lit a small camping lantern and cooked dinner. A simple meal of instant noodles and jerky. The quiet was overwhelming, but in a comforting way. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional call of a distant bird. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the forest was pitch black. I lay there for a while, staring up at the mesh of my tent and the faint glimmer of stars above. Sleep came easily. The first night passed without incident. I woke with the sun, feeling refreshed and ready to explore. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my day pack and headed out. The forest was beautiful, with towering trees and patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy. I followed the stream for a while, then veered off to climb a rocky outcrop I'd spotted in the distance. The view from the top was breathtaking, miles of unbroken forest stretching to the horizon. I spent the day wandering, losing track of time as I soaked in the solitude. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already dipping low. I made another simple meal and settled in for the evening. That night, though, I found it harder to sleep. The silence that had been so comforting now felt oppressive. Every little noise, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest, nothing to worry about. The second day followed much the same pattern. Hiking, exploring, enjoying the wilderness. But by the time I returned to camp that evening, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the clearing didn't seem quite the same. My gear was untouched, and nothing appeared out of place. But the air felt heavier, the quiet deeper. I shrugged it off, blaming my imagination. That night, the unease grew. I woke up several times, certain I'd heard something outside the tent. Each time, I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. But there was nothing, just the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. On the third day, I decided to cut my trip short. The unease had settled into a constant weight in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I packed up my gear, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. The forest, once so inviting, now felt claustrophobic. The hike back to my car was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd hear a faint rustle or crack behind me, but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the usual forest noises, but my nerves were on edge. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, a wave of relief washed over me. I loaded my gear into the trunk as quickly as I could, eager to leave the forest behind. But as I slid into the driver's seat, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the dusty rear window of my car, were smudges. Not handprints exactly, but marks that looked like someone had brushed their fingers across the glass. I stared at them for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. Had they been there when I arrived? Couldn't remember. Maybe I'd brushed against the window myself without realizing it. Or maybe I didn't stick around to figure it out. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The drive home felt endless, every shadow on the road making my heart race. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring at my darkened house. Home had never felt so safe. I never did figure out what happened on that trip. Maybe it was all in my head, a product of too much time alone in the wilderness. Or maybe, well, I don't know. All I know is that I haven't been camping alone since. Camping alone had always been a calming escape for me. The solitude, the absence of modern distractions, and the humbling presence of nature allowed me to reset and refocus. That weekend, I had decided to explore a less frequented area of the Green Mountains in Vermont. It was early October, and the foliage was breathtaking. A fiery blend of oranges, yellows, and reds. The trail I chose was unmarked, a faint path locals had mentioned but wasn't on any official maps. That made it perfect for some quiet reflection. I parked my car at the base of a dirt road, well off the beaten path. From there, I hiked for about 6 hours into the woods. The trail wasn't obvious in some spots, but I'd brought a topographic map and a GPS. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing beside a stream. The place seemed ideal for setting up camp. The water source was close, and the clearing was surrounded by tall pines that blocked most of the wind. Setting up camp took about an hour. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground, gathered some firewood, and made a small fire. Dinner was a simple freeze-dried meal, nothing fancy but enough to fill me up. As the sun set, the temperature dropped significantly. I wrapped myself in my jacket and sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of burning wood and the gentle babble of the stream. It felt perfect, peaceful and disconnected from the world. The first sign of something being off came just after dusk. I heard a distant rustling in the woods. At first, I dismissed it as wildlife. Deer and other animals were common in these parts, and the sound wasn't unusual. But the rustling continued, growing closer and more deliberate. I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the fire, and shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound revealed nothing but trees. Still, it left me feeling uneasy. I decided to stoke the fire and make it brighter, figuring a larger flame might keep animals at bay. The noise stopped for a while, and I chalked it up to my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the hours crept on, I retreated to my tent, zipping it up tightly and keeping my flashlight and knife within reach. Around midnight, I woke up abruptly. At first, I didn't know why. The fire outside had died down to embers, and the air inside the tent was cold. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving carefully, almost cautiously. The steps were too heavy to belong to an animal. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, as the footsteps stopped right outside my tent. My mind raced. I hadn't seen another person since I started my hike. Who could possibly be out here and why? I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly in one hand while holding my flashlight in the other. Then, without warning, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I lay awake for hours, listening for any sound, but the forest had gone eerily silent. By dawn, I was exhausted but determined to stay cautious. I stepped outside my tent, knife in hand, and scanned the area. There were footprints in the dirt around my campsite. They were large and human. My stomach churned at the realization. Whoever had been there wasn't trying to hide their presence. The thought made me uneasy. I quickly packed up my gear, deciding to cut the trip short and head back to my car. The hike back felt different. The woods, which had seemed serene and welcoming on the way in, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The trail, already faint, seemed harder to follow on the way back. Several times, I had to stop and check my map and GPS to make sure I was on the right path. About halfway back, I came across something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a tree branch was a small bundle of sticks tied together with a piece of frayed rope. It looked deliberate, almost like some kind of marker or warning. The rope was weathered but recently placed. I took a photo with my phone, not sure why, and then hurried past it. As I continued, I noticed more of these bundles, each one slightly different but all tied with the same type of rope. They appeared at irregular intervals, always just off the trail. I couldn't make sense of them, but their presence unnerved me. Someone had been out here recently, and they'd gone to considerable effort to leave these behind. The final stretch of the hike felt endless. By the time I reached the dirt road where I'd parked, the sun was starting to set. Relief washed over me as I spotted my car. But as I approached, I noticed something was wrong. The back window had been smashed, and the doors were unlocked. My heart sank. I checked inside and found that my emergency supplies, a first aid kit, extra food, and a blanket were missing. The rest of my belongings, including the car's registration and a few personal items, were untouched. It felt like a message, though I couldn't decipher what it meant. I didn't waste any time. I started the car and drove back toward civilization as quickly as the rough dirt road allowed. Every so often, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road. It wasn't until I reached a small town and found a gas station that I began to feel safe. I reported the incident to the local authorities, showing them the photos of the footprints and the strange bundles I'd found. The officer I spoke to took my statement but didn't seem overly concerned. Could have been some kids messing around, he said, but I knew better. The deliberate nature of the bundles and the calculated way the person had moved around my camp didn't feel like a prank. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what their intentions were. I've gone camping many times since, but I'm much more cautious now. I stick to well-traveled trails and established campgrounds, and I always let someone know exactly where I'm going. The woods are beautiful, but they're also vast and unpredictable. That trip was a stark reminder that while nature can be serene, it's not the only thing you need to be wary of out there. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wild, away from the constant noise and chaos of daily life, that just feels right. The crackle of a campfire, the smell of pine trees, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. It's like hitting a reset button. So when I got a rare weekend off work, I decided to head out alone for a couple of nights in the woods. I'd done solo trips before and felt comfortable enough to handle myself. I chose a spot about an hour's drive from my place. It wasn't a popular campsite, just a patch of wilderness with a few trails and a river nearby, perfect for some peace and quiet. The plan was to hike a few miles in, set up camp, and spend the weekend fishing, reading, and enjoying the solitude. I packed light but made sure I had the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a small cooking kit, some dried food, water purification tablets, and a first aid kit. I also brought a small hatchet for firewood and my trusty knife, which I always carried when camping. Before leaving, I let my friend know where I'd be and when to expect me back, a habit I never skipped. The drive was uneventful, and I reached the trailhead around mid-morning. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a slight chill in the air, and no sign of rain. I parked my car, shouldered my backpack, and started hiking. The trail wound through dense forest, and the further I went, the quieter it became. After about 2 hours, I found a nice clearing near the river. It was flat, sheltered by tall trees, and had a good view of the water. Setting up camp didn't take long. I pitched my tent on a dry patch of ground, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. By early afternoon, I was sitting by the river with my fishing rod, soaking up the calm. The fish weren't biting much, but I didn't mind. Just being out there was enough. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, I cooked a simple dinner over the fire. The woods were starting to come alive with the sounds of night: crickets chirping, frogs croaking, and the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt a deep sense of contentment as I sat by the fire, sipping on a cup of tea and watching the flames dance. When the fire began to die down, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and drifted off to sleep. The first night passed without incident. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the trees and the sound of birds chirping. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the river upstream, keeping an eye out for anything interesting. The forest felt alive, and I took my time, enjoying the sights and sounds. Around midday, I came across something odd. It was a small pile of rocks, carefully stacked in a clearing near the river. It didn't look like a natural formation. Someone had arranged them deliberately, I'd seen things like this before on hiking trails. Sometimes people built cairns to mark a path or as a sort of art. But this one felt out of place. It was too far off the trail, and there were no signs of recent foot traffic in the area. Still, I didn't think much of it and continued on my way. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. I spent the rest of the day fishing and reading, occasionally glancing at the forest around me. There was a slight unease in the back of my mind, but I brushed it off. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. The woods can play tricks on your mind when you're alone. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought I heard something in the distance. It was faint, almost like a whistle or a hum. I paused, straining to hear, but it stopped. Probably just the wind or some animal, I thought. But as I got ready to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone out there. The second night was different. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was faint at first, a soft rustling like something moving through the underbrush. My heart started pounding as I lay there, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound grew louder, closer. I reached for my flashlight and knife, every nerve in my body on edge. When I finally mustered the courage to unzip the tent and shine my light outside, there was nothing there. The forest was still, almost unnaturally quiet. I scanned the area but saw no signs of movement. After a while, I convinced myself it was just a deer or some other animal passing through and crawled back into my tent. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of my campsite, the ground was disturbed. There were scuff marks in the dirt, like someone had been walking around. But the prints were strange. Too large to be human and oddly spaced, almost as if whoever or whatever made them had been moving on all fours. I'd seen animal tracks before, but these didn't match anything I recognized. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I kept busy, gathering firewood and fishing, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. By the time evening rolled around, I was questioning whether I should stay another night. As darkness fell, I built a larger fire than usual, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. I sat with my back to the flames, facing the forest, knife in hand. Hours passed, and the woods seemed to close in around me. The usual nighttime sounds were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then I heard it again, the rustling, closer this time. My pulse quickened as I strained to see beyond the firelight. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was low to the ground, moving quickly and silently. I froze, gripping my knife tightly. The figure stopped just outside the circle of light, and for a moment we both stayed perfectly still. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it darted back into the darkness. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the fire, knife in hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning finally came, I wasted no time packing up. I left the campsite as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder as I hiked back to the trailhead. The feeling of being watched never left me. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted but relieved to be out of those woods. I don't know what I encountered out there. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But those tracks and the way the figure moved didn't feel natural. I haven't been camping alone since that trip, and I don't think I ever will again.